Okay, so just to summarize, in the first video, I spent a few minutes looking through the question, setting up my 1D array, my 2D array, my variables, my constants, any other 1D or 2D arrays that I might have needed. I made sure things were initialized. I made sure things were declared. I made sure that I used appropriate variable or identifier names for these different data structures. In the second video, I completed the first bullet point, which was calculating the combined total mark for each of these students. Essentially, I was looking or iterating through a 2D array and totaling up one row and then adding the total into a 1D array, which I call total scores. Okay, now I'm working on to the second bullet point, which is calculating the average mark for each student rounded to the nearest whole number. Now, when I read that bullet point, I started to think about the next bullet point, which is I'm going to have to print all of this off. So I've got 5 students. I could have had a 10, I could have had 20, I could have had 50. So I have the same problem that I highlighted earlier, which is where am I going to store all this information? I can make variables for each student, but then every time another student joins the class, I've got to go into my program and I've got to make another variable. It's not very practical. So the best thing is I need another array. I need an array where I can store the average score. So I'm going to go back up to the top over here and I'm going to call it average scores or average score because it's going to be for an individual, and I'm going to initialize everyone to 0. How many of these do I need? Well, I need the same as class size, yeah, because obviously each person is going to have their own little index in the 1D array to store the average score. Now all I need to do is I need to iterate through the 1D array, the 1D array that has the total scores in, and I divide it by the number of tests. So I'm just doing a mean average. So let's do for count in range. And you remember earlier on I talked about creating a variable called count. I'm not sure where it is over here, so just to be extra sure, I'm just going to go back up to the top over here and I'm going to make count equals 0, just making sure I'm initializing my variable. So for count in range, and how many times am I going to go around this particular looping structure? Well, I'm doing one for each student. There's 5 students. I've already got class size, so I'm going to go around class size number. And what am I going to do? Well, I'm trying to store something in my average score array. So average score is going to equal something. So average score. And remember, this is a 1D array, so I need to store it and I need to give an index number. Well, how am I going to do this? Well, I need, the first time around, I need to store it in index 0. The second time around, I need to store it in index 1, up 2, 3, 4. So what I have I have count. So why don't I just use count as my index number? What am I going to store inside count? Well, I'm going to store total scores. And also I'm iterating through each individual one, so I'm going to use count again. Remember, every index for each person matches up, so index score count. I'm going to divide them by, what am I going to do over here? So I've got 3 scores, so I could do divided by 3, but what happens if students do another test and I add another row or another column of scores in? So better to use a variable which stores the number of subjects, and I already have that, so I'm just going to go with subject number. So what I now have is average score for each index is going to equal the total score. Okay, that's actually total scores. Okay, I can see the underline there. And I'm going to use each index, I'm going to divide it by subject number. Now the issue, if I was to do it like this, it's going to give me most likely a decimal number, because whenever we do dividing, we're going to end up with a decimal number, which I don't want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to surround this in brackets and I'm just going to int it at the front. So what I'm doing is I'm getting rid of any part of the decimal number. Yeah. Now if I run this program, and I just need to check that it works, if I print off the average score array, let's run this and see what I get. I get 24, 46, and I know it's roughly right because I put different numbers in that. Average of that looks like it's roughly 24, that one's 46 and 54 and so on and so forth. The only issue I've got here is when I use int, what I end up doing is I end up rounding it to its floor value. So if someone gets, for example, a score of 26.6, it's just going to get rid of the 0.6. So I have a bit of a problem over here, and this is one of the unique characteristics of this particular question, but it wants it rounded to the nearest whole number. So if it was 26.6, it actually needs to round it up. So there's a trick that we can do for this, and the trick for this is simply, we just, before we int it, we take total scores and divide it by the subject number, and we just add 0.5 on there. And once we add 0.5 in there, what we're doing is we're just making sure that if it was 21.1 and we add 0.5, and we convert it to an int, it's going to end up with 21. But let's say if it was 21.6 and we add 0.5, it then becomes 27.1, and it gets rid of the 0.1, and so it automatically rounds it upwards. And if I now run the program a second time, you can see some of the numbers change there. The first one went from 24 to 25, just because I'm adding the half on, just to make sure that the ones that are above 5 and above, 0.5 and above, do round upwards. And that's simply that section done. That's the second bullet point done, which is calculating the average mark for every student rounded to the nearest whole number. So second part done and dusted, nice and easy.